Everything you see, roads, laws, languages, was etched in the dust of one vanished empire. In the next few hours you'll watch it rise, burn, and echo into your own life. Stay to the end, because Rome's last secret rewrites our future. Watch, subscribe, and step into history. How does a civilization that ruled 3 continents for over 1,000 years simply vanish? Not in a day. Not in a single fall. But in a series of choices, victories, illusions, and slow decay. This is the story of Rome, from glory to ghost. An Ostrogothic courier splashes ashore at the half-ruined Castellum Lucullanum, once Lucullus' pleasure palace, now a monastery smelling of salt and stale parchment. The letter he carries is signed by Theodoric the Great himself. To Romulus, once called Augustus, keeper of our peace, your pension shall continue. Pray for the realm. The empire had been dead on paper for 35 years, yet its conqueror still mailed a salary to the ghost of an emperor. Theodoric wasn't being generous, he was buying legitimacy, 1 gold solidus at a time. Those payments kept senatorial estates loyal to Gothic rulers, delaying Byzantium's reconquest by a generation. The monastery's rulebook names a lay brother, Romulus, donator of 6 amphorae of Falernian wine each Lent. Local oral tradition says the same man refused meat, lived in his father's old cuirass, and compulsively copied Virgil's verses in the margins of psalms. Fragments of these manuscripts survive in Naples' Biblioteca Nazionale, palimpsests where imperial purple ink peeks beneath monkish brown. Why does an ex-emperor hide under religious anonymity? Because every political faction in Italy saw him as a potential banner. Survival meant erasing himself. Ravenna's marshes echo with foreign war chants. Odoacer, commander of Germanic Federati, seizes the imperial palace. He executes Orestes in Pavia, but leaves Orestes' 13-year-old son alive. Odoacer needed the Roman Senate to crown him Rex Italiae the next morning. Slaughtering a child emperor would disgust those patricians. Sparing him cost nothing and bought silence. The Senate's craven gratitude gave Odoacer legal cover to dismantle the Western court, yet the same senators later welcomed Theodoric's invasion, proving their loyalty was for rent. Inside Ravenna's throne room, Orestes hoists his son onto a solid silver curule chair. The boy's feet don't touch the footstool. Courtiers mutter the nickname Augustulus, Little Augustus. Official scribes strike Julius Nepos from the diptychs. Fewer than 30 bronze coins were ever minted with Romulus monogram, and every die came from re-engraved Nepos blanks, numismatic plagiarism that still fools collectors. Nepos survives in Dalmatia, claiming to be the real emperor. Constantinople pretends to agree, using the dispute as leverage to meddle in Italian politics until his assassination in 480. Born in Ravenna, cradle rocked by the surge of tidewater under mosaic ceilings, Romulus learned diplomacy at his father's knee. Orestes, once Attila the Hun's Latin secretary, taught him Hunnic war chants as bedtime songs. An ivory writing tablet found at Aquileia bears both a Latin alphabet and runes scratched by a child's hand. Epigraphers date the rune shapes to late 5th century Pannonian Germanic. Strong evidence Romulus dabbled in the script of the very mercenaries who would end his reign. Ask modern scholars and you'll hear the safe verdict. Romulus Augustulus mattered only symbolically. But symbols move armies. His living presence, pensioned, silent, haunting a seaside fortress. Let every would-be ruler claim continuity with Rome while reshaping Italy in their own image. Byzantine propagandists cited him to prove the West had forfeited its crown. justifying Justinian's bloody reconquest. Carolingian ideologues skipped him entirely, crowning Charlemagne as a new Augustus in 800 to erase the embarrassment of a teenage predecessor. Neapolitan folklore still whispers that Castel dell'Ovo, the fortress built atop his villa, holds an egg. If it breaks, the city falls. Rome's last emperor traded for a folk talisman. Rome didn't fall in 476. It mutated, hiding inside monasteries, legal codes, and childhood nicknames. And somewhere in the half-lit cloisters of Campania, a forgotten boy kept the ember alive, long enough for emperors, popes, and kings to fight over its dying glow. The last Roman emperor wasn't murdered. He wasn't exiled. He wasn't even Roman. He was a child, placed on a throne as bait. Ravenna, 476 AD. The empire had already withered. Gaul was gone. Spain belonged to the Visigoths. The richest Roman province, Africa, had been under Vandal control for 40 years. There was no empire left to govern. But a throne still stood, and that throne needed a face. So a father, Orestes, put his son Romulus on it. Not because the boy had legitimacy, but because he didn't. He was expendable. You want to understand why Rome fell? It's here. They stopped putting power in the hands of men who could wield it, and gave it to boys they could control. Odoacer is always framed as the villain, the barbarian who ended Rome. But here's what they never tell you. He was a Roman citizen, born in Pannonia, trained in the imperial army, and once fought for Rome against Attila. When he seized Ravenna, he didn't loot it. He didn't burn it. He spared the Senate, preserved Roman law, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. Odoacer didn't topple Rome. He embalmed it, kept the body intact while the soul leaked out. Romulus Augustulus was never recognized as emperor by Constantinople. The real emperor was Julius Nepos, alive in Dalmatia, ruling a shadow court with almost no troops. And yet, neither he nor Romulus died violently. They were both left to drift. In 511 AD, 35 years after Romulus' fall, Theodoric the Great confirmed Romulus's pension. He wasn't killed. He was paid to disappear. What? Because as long as Romulus lived, the illusion of unity, the idea that Roman titles could still pass from one hand to another, remained useful. The Eastern Roman Empire didn't mourn the fall of the West. It welcomed it. Emperor Zeno had long distrusted the Western court, especially after Orestes had defied his command. So when Odoacer seized Italy, Zeno called him Patrician of the West, a Roman title, a blessing from Constantinople. No armies marched to restore Romulus. The Eastern Empire didn't fail to save the West. It let it die. The West was an unruly partner. Now it was a client state, governed by a foreign king who owed his throne to the East. Here's what your textbooks don't tell you. After 476, Roman courts still operated in Italy. Roman taxes were still collected. Senators still wore togas. The only difference? The orders came from a man with a Gothic name. Rome's fall didn't look like a collapse. It looked like continuity. But under the surface, power had changed hands. The empire didn't fall because it was attacked. It fell because no one inside it believed in it anymore. And while Rome pretended to live, another city quietly became its heir. Not in Italy, but across the sea. Its name was Constantinople. And it called itself Rome for another 1,000 years. 1204 AD. A Christian army breaches the gates of Constantinople, not as liberators but as thieves. A crusade, funded by loans from Venetian bankers, has turned inward. Instead of marching on Jerusalem, they burned the capital of Christendom. One of the relics looted was the Virgin Mary's undergarment, carried off by a French baron who claimed it stopped storms at sea. The city's most sacred library? Burned. Monks beaten. Nuns raped. Icons defaced. It wasn't Muslims who broke the spine of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was Christians. Let's trace the roots of fragility, not the narrative of glory. For centuries, the Byzantines had claimed to be God's chosen empire. But they had become experts at buying peace, not securing it. They bribed barbarians with titles. They bought alliances with daughters. They negotiated away strength to preserve symbols. The empire had not been building, it had been bargaining. Byzantines claimed they were the unbroken continuation of Rome. But was that even true? The last Eastern emperor to speak Latin fluently was Heraclius, over 400 years before the fall. Greek replaced Latin in court, in law, even in the liturgy. The Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's masterpiece, was no longer read. It became a fossil of prestige. By the 11th century they were Romans only in title, an empire that still used the name but had forgotten the language. How long can a thing claim to be itself, after it's changed its soul? Constantine didn't just choose Byzantium for spiritual reasons. He chose it for defensive geography, for fresh water, for distance from Rome's rotting elite. Constantinople had no pagan temples in its original plan. Constantine didn't convert the old world, he abandoned it. He didn't Christianize Rome. He replaced it. That wasn't continuity. It was a hostile takeover, marketed as legacy. Through civil wars, iconoclasm, plagues, and theological crackdowns, the Byzantine Empire survived not by power, but by illusion. They sent empty grain ships to provinces and claimed God had blessed the harvest. They raised taxes in Christ's name and forged relics to justify policy. They crowned child emperors and eunuch regents, and still claimed divine order. They weaponized the idea of Rome, even as the machinery behind it rusted. By 1453, there was no Roman Empire left. Just marble and memories. The Hagia Sophia had been patched, not renovated. The army was mostly Genoese mercenaries. The treasury held fewer coins than an Ottoman city mint made in a week. The last emperor, Constantine XI, had no heirs, no fleet, no legacy to leave. But he died with his sword drawn, because symbols, once weaponized, can no longer be put away quietly. Rome's final echo wasn't in a law, or a language, or a city. It was in a man who refused to kneel, because he still believed in the fiction. In 451 AD, Rome was saved by a ghost, one wearing a bishop's robe. Attila's army, hundreds of thousands, had already razed cities. Aquileia, Milan, Pavia, gone. Rome was next. But no army stood in his way. Just one old man dressed in white. Pope Leo didn't come with gold or threats. He came with a story, one we've never fully understood. As Leo stood before Attila, two ghostly figures hovered behind him, Peter and Paul, swords drawn. Attila turned around. He left. He never attacked Rome. History says the Pope's words stopped a horde. What if it was fear of a power no sword could cut? But why did Leo have power Rome's emperors no longer did? Everyone knows Constantine's conversion. The cross in the sky. The victory at Milvian Bridge. But here's what no one says out loud. He didn't convert to Jesus. He converted to control. He kept pagan titles. He killed his wife and son after baptism. He made bishops imperial puppets. And he built Constantinople not to honor God, but to run from Rome's political rot. He baptized the empire, but kept the sword bloody. The first Christian capital had no church for 65 years. So what was Constantine really building? A holy city or a theocratic empire? In Thessalonica, Roman soldiers kill 7,000 in a stadium. A massacre. The emperor responsible is barred from church. Not by soldiers. Not by senators. By a bishop. Ambrose of Milan makes Theodosius kneel in ash, barefoot, before entering the basilica. When the emperor knelt, the empire changed forever. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was a transfer of supremacy. The throne now served the altar. Ambrose publicly ordered the destruction of a pagan temple in Syria, which even Julian the Apostate had spared. The church wasn't meek anymore. It had become Rome's new military. What happens when the cross becomes the crown? 410 to 455 AD. The Goths who sacked Rome were Christians, just not the right kind. They followed Arianism, a heresy by Nicene standards. And who had converted them? Roman missionaries. Rome gave the barbarians their first book, the Bible. The Goths gave Rome its first sack. Rome armed its enemies with faith, then called it treason. When Alaric entered Rome in 410, he ordered all churches left untouched. Some said he treated St. Peter's Basilica with more reverence than Roman generals did. If the destroyers believed in Christ, whose empire were they destroying? Year 476 AD. The last emperor was a child. No one fought to keep him. Odoacer sent the crown to the east, and then asked the Pope for recognition. And he got it. Why? Because by then the papacy had replaced the imperial idea. Rome was still ruling, but with bishops, not Caesars. The clergy held land, armies, diplomacy. And most importantly, they held narrative. The Western Empire didn't fall. It was euthanized by the church, and buried in a marble tomb inscribed with prayers. Rome's greatest illusion wasn't its legions. It was that it ruled by law. Severus enters with blood on his hands. Not metaphorically. He has just murdered 29 senators after winning the Civil War. He doesn't apologize. He simply says, "I have been everything except a good man." He leaves the bodies of rival senators outside the Curia for 3 days. No one moves them. Not even priests. Not even their families. Backtrack to Hadrian, the man who built walls. He also personally signed over 100,000 death warrants after crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea. Children were sold into slavery in Damascus. Villages were wiped from the map. Rome named a new province, Syria Palestina, erasing Judea from memory. He built marble libraries in Athens, and mass graves in Jerusalem. Hadrian's architect Apollodorus insulted the emperor's design ideas, and was executed over a drawing. We always joke about the mad emperor in the arena, but here's the real horror. He charged the Roman treasury for every animal he killed as an imperial service. He renamed all 12 months after himself. He called Rome Colonia Commodiana, literally, Commodus Town. Senators wrote poems praising him, while also hiring assassins to poison his food. One group used a female concubine to strangle him in a bath. Rome survived because its madmen died faster than their empire decayed. Now spin back to the illusion. Augustus 27 BC. The Senate offers him unlimited power. He refuses, pretends to hand it back, then accepts it again reluctantly, with new titles. Augustus created a mask so perfect, even he forgot it was a disguise. His residential gesti, carved in stone across the empire, mentions no civil wars, no murders, no political purges. Only gifts to the people, and temples restored. But he left one thing out. He had 300 senators killed in 43 BC with Mark Antony and Lepidus. He called it a proscription, legal murder of political rivals. Augustus didn't found an empire. He buried a republic and wrote the eulogy in marble. He sees what the others ignored. Rome can't be ruled by one man, unless that man is a god. He divides the empire in two, creates the tetrarchy, institutes tax reforms so harsh he had to issue price ceilings on haircuts. Worship of the emperor returns, now enforced by law. To survive, Diocletian made the empire immortal, but removed its humanity. He voluntarily abdicates, then watches from his garden in Dalmatia as the empire he saved descends into civil war within 1 year. Rome doesn't collapse. It mutates. Christianity enters the bloodstream. Emperors become saints. Heretics become enemies of the state. Rome wasn't destroyed. It was reborn, in God's image. In 133 BC, Rome passed a law restricting how much grain a citizen could buy, not because of famine, but because too many people were still dreaming about Carthage. 17 years after Carthage is gone, Rome is unraveling. Citizens riot over cheap wheat. Soldiers return from foreign wars with no land. The Senate fears revolution. But no one says the word aloud. They say something else instead. The ghost of Carthage is among us. Roman senators accused Tiberius Gracchus of reintroducing Punic policy when he proposed land reform. Why? Because Carthage had once given farmland to veterans freely, and Rome now feared it would turn its poor into a mob. If Carthage is ash, why does its shadow still scare Rome's elite? Carthage was reborn after the Second Punic War. Prosperous, non-violent, merchant-driven. What triggered the Third Punic War? Rome claimed Carthage broke a treaty because it defended itself against Numidian raiders. That was the excuse. But here's the truth. Roman merchants wanted Carthaginian grain markets. And Cato the Elder, senile, bitter, ended every speech, even on irrigation, with Carthago delenda isti. Carthage must be destroyed. Cato once visited Carthage, saw its markets full, its harbor booming, and returned to Rome with a rotting fig. He held it up in the Senate and said, "This fig was picked just 3 days ago, in Carthage." The implication? They're too close, too strong, too fast. The war Rome waged wasn't against an enemy army. It was against the future. So how do you erase a future that never lifted a sword? Zama was a defeat, but not a slaughter. Hannibal survived. He became a statesman. He created financial reforms that strengthened Carthage's treasury without Rome's permission. What did Rome do? They demanded he resign. He did. Then they demanded his exile. He fled. Hannibal later served as a military advisor to Antiochus III of Syria, Rome's enemy. But Rome wasn't worried about war. They were terrified Hannibal would speak, would remind the world that Carthage was still alive in him. Rome didn't kill Hannibal's body. It chased his memory across continents. What does it mean when your greatest enemy refuses to die, and refuses to hate you back? 60,000 Romans killed. Entire families erased. Afterward, Rome banned public mourning. What? Fear that grief would cause revolt. Survivors of Cannae were branded cursed, denied burial with honor, denied promotion. Rome punished the living because the dead were too many to honor. This wasn't just defeat. It was trauma so deep the Republic rewrote its own customs to avoid looking in the mirror. But what if Rome wasn't afraid of losing to Hannibal? What if Rome was afraid of becoming him? Carthage surrenders. No army left. Offers hostages. Offers tribute. Rome marches in anyway. Scipio watches as children scream inside temples, the flames licking up behind them. His men salt the earth, a ritual never repeated in Roman history. This wasn't strategy. It was symbolic sterilization. Carthage had to die because it had become an idea, and Rome feared ideas more than armies. After the sack, the Roman Senate debated rebuilding Carthage, not as a city but as a reminder of Roman glory. It passed, but was never done. Why? Because some feared Carthage might rise again, even from a monument. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, he didn't just bring elephants. He brought a mirror. And Rome hated what it saw in its own reflection. Start here. Not in the Senate, not on the battlefield, but in Capua, where entire Roman-aligned cities begin defecting to Hannibal. Why? Because Rome failed to protect them. Hannibal fed them, defended them, gave them autonomy. He liberated, not conquered. After the fall of Capua, Roman soldiers slaughtered entire city populations who had defected, including children, to set an example. Rome called it loyalty. But to the allies, it looked like abandonment. Can a republic survive if half its own world begins to prefer the enemy? Fabius didn't just delay. He undermined his own co-commander, Minucius Rufus, allowing him to take command, and then let him walk into a trap Hannibal had set. Yes, what? Him. So Fabius could then show up, rescue him, and be proven right. Contemporary accounts from Roman tribunes accused Fabius of orchestrated neglect. Not cowardice. Calculus. He didn't win battles. He choreographed humiliation. To stay in power. What happens when your savior is also your saboteur? Forget strategy. The real reason Scipio went to Africa wasn't to trap Hannibal. It was to escape Rome. The Senate had launched an audit into his illegal financial dealings in Spain. He was nearly indicted. The records of the audit mysteriously vanished. Historians suspect Scipio paid off scribes with his Spanish loot. So he fled. He dressed it as invasion. The savior of Rome wasn't fleeing Hannibal. He was fleeing investigation. Would Rome have executed its own hero if he stayed? Here's what the myths don't tell you. Zama wasn't a glorious showdown. Hannibal's cavalry never showed. What? Because Massinissa, Scipio's Numidian ally, bribed Carthaginian officers to delay Hannibal's support. Carthage's second line never even entered the battle. They held back, fearing betrayal. Which means Zama was lost before it began. Hannibal didn't lose a war. He lost a backroom deal. Why didn't Hannibal ever expose the treachery? Scipio returns home. A hero? No. The Senate drags him into court for embezzlement. The same men who cheered him 15 years earlier now call him a threat to the Republic. He is not buried in Rome. His tomb hidden. Forgotten. Not even a statue remains. His final words? Ungrateful country, you shall not even have my bones. Rome doesn't forgive debt, even when it's paid in blood. So who really won? The general who vanished, or the memory of the man he destroyed? The Second Punic War didn't end in battle. It ended in courtrooms, in censored archives, in forgotten tombs. Rome didn't win because it was just. It won because it erased everything that made it vulnerable. including its own memory. Rome didn't burn Carthage because it hated it. It burned Carthage because it recognized it. Place Roman Forum. Merchants grumble. Not because of famine, but because North African grain is flooding the market. Cheaper. Cleaner. More plentiful than Roman fields could match. A whisper starts in the forum, Carthage is back. But not with swords. With ships. Commerce. Currency. The empire built by legions was now terrified of the balance sheet. A Senate record from this year shows an embargo proposed on Carthaginian olive oil, not because it was inferior but because it was outselling Roman. What happens when your greatest enemy stops fighting and starts outperforming? You've heard Carthago delendes, but did you know Cato timed it? He began inserting it at the exact midpoint of every unrelated speech regardless of topic. Aqueducts. Coin reforms. Military budgets. What? Because the Roman stenographic record system copied these speeches into training scrolls. Meaning Cato's phrase would echo in every provincial school, junior military camp, and record room for generations. He didn't shout for war. He programmed the Republic. Even a century later, a senator in Hispania ends his tax speech with Carthago delenda est. He didn't know why. He was copying format. What kind of fear lives long enough to become ritual? When Rome demands hostages, Carthage gives them. When Rome demands weapons, Carthage melts them. When Rome demands they move inland, they don't scream. They don't fight. They begin digging tunnels beneath their own temples. Archaeological findings confirm Carthaginians created an entire shadow arsenal beneath the Temple of Eshmun, while negotiations with Rome continued. They were building in the dark. Carthage answered the loudest empire in history with complete, coordinated silence. And when silence breaks, what kind of scream does it become? It's over. The Bursa is burning. Survivors line up for chains. Scipio walks alone through the remains. He doesn't smile. He doesn't gloat. He kneels by a scorched wall, where someone carved a name, Tanith, the goddess of Carthage. It's still warm. Still sacred. He mutters Homer's line, not to mock Carthage but to warn Rome. A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish. Scipio ordered a Carthaginian child spared, taken to Rome, and adopted into his household. No records survive of what became of her. Did he save a life, or bring Carthage's ghost into Rome's heart? Carthage didn't die in war. It was buried in Rome's mind, whispering to every future empire, "You are not as eternal as you think." If this moment stunned you, good. Because history was never meant to be comfortable. And the next revelation? It's the one they've buried the deepest. So hit that subscribe button, because the story isn't over. Like this video if it forced you to see Rome differently. And comment below. What else have we been told? That wasn't true. We're not just telling history here. We're unearthing it. The first Roman general to march on his own city didn't break the law. He proved there were none left. Lucius Cornelius Sulla rides into the city atop his warhorse, his own legions behind him. Rome's streets, still wet from overnight rain, are filled with citizens running toward temples. Not to pray, to hide. Sulla's soldiers, legal Roman citizens, begin dragging senators from their homes. No trial. No charges. Just sword and silence. One senator, Publius Damasippus, was executed with his Senate robe stuffed in his mouth, a mockery of the endless debates that had once governed Rome. Rome had always feared barbarians. But this time the boots on the marble were their own. Where is Caesar during all this? watching, learning, planning. At just 18, Caesar is ordered by Sulla to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Marius' ally. He refuses. Not out of love, out of something more dangerous, calculated defiance. Sulla spares him barely, but warns the Senate. There are many Mariuses in this boy, and one Caesar is enough to destroy us all. Caesar flees the city in disguise with a bounty on his head, not for treason but for having potential. He vanishes into the east, and doesn't come back until Rome forgets why it feared him. What happens to a man who watches his homeland turn executions into policy? Sulla returns as dictator and posts a public kill list, called the Proscriptio. If your name is on it, you are legally dead. No trial, no burial, no protest. Citizens rush to turn in their neighbors and collect rewards from the state. One teenage boy killed his own father, claimed the bounty, then bought a seat in the Senate with it. His name has been erased from all surviving records, on Sulla's orders. The Republic didn't collapse. It mutated into something unrecognizable, ruled by gold, betrayal, and knives. There's a survivor on the list, who will spend the next decade preparing his own list. After 3 years of blood, Sulla voluntarily steps down. No assassination, no rebellion, just a man walking away with the words, "Let no man be greater than the Republic." But here's the truth, he knew it was already dead. After resigning, Sulla threw a lavish retirement party and personally insulted every major senator, knowing none would dare retaliate. Not because they respected him, because they were terrified. Rome had learned a new kind of governance, fear disguised as order. Into this vacuum walks the man who learned from them all, Caesar, with charm, with ambition, and with a longer memory than any of them suspect. Sulla proved a dictator could step down, but no one noticed the real damage. He taught Rome what it looked like when one man could outlive the law, and the boy who watched him do it would never forget. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the real decision had already been made. Not by him, not by Pompey, but by the Roman people. They had stopped believing in the Republic. A Senate hall with more echoes than voices. Half the seats are empty. Pompey sits like a statue. The tribunes speak, but even they know, no one is listening. The average Roman knew more about Caesar's victories in Gaul than they knew about their own magistrates in office. Why? Because Caesar paid professional writers to distribute battle summaries across the forum like political flyers. Caesar wasn't just winning wars. He was stealing belief. And Rome never took it back. What no one tells you is that Caesar wrote 6 letters to the Senate, offering peace. The last one was never read aloud. The consuls burned it, because it made him look too reasonable. Cicero, who hated Caesar, admitted privately in his letters, "If I were a common man, I'd follow Caesar too." They didn't fear his ambition. They feared how easy it was to love him. Pompey had more legions, more friends in the Senate. But he also had one fatal weakness. He never looked like hope. In early 49 BC, the city of Capua offered Pompey control of their grain stores. He refused. Caesar accepted it days later, and turned them into a military supply depot. The war wasn't won on the battlefield. It was won in the bakeries and alleys. Here's what textbooks skip. Caesar didn't kill anyone at the Rubicon. There was no battle. No standoff. It wasn't a war. It was a realization. The first blood was spilled days earlier, when Caesar's agents infiltrated Rome and burned the state archives of the Senate's emergency decrees. That fire destroyed hundreds of legal documents that would have justified Pompey's martial law. Historians gloss over it. But Caesar's biographers never mention the fire. Why? Because it made him look less like a liberator, and more like a strategist with a knife behind his smile. When Caesar entered Rome, he didn't come as a conqueror. He came as a familiar face. The man who fed them, entertained them, and wrote them stories. Pompey fled. Not because he had to, but because he knew Rome wanted Caesar. One ancient commentary claims that as Caesar's soldiers marched into the Forum, a child dropped a toy gladius and shouted, "Hail Caesar!" The Republic didn't fall. It applauded. Caesar didn't kill the Republic. He didn't need to. It walked to the riverbank with him and handed him the crown no one dared admit existed. Next episode, March 15th, the day a god bled in public. We won't start with Brutus. We'll start with a rumor that Caesar knew the exact hour he would die and refused to stop it. The last breath of the Roman Republic wasn't heard in the Forum. It was choked out behind marble columns by men who had no plan for the morning after. We don't start with daggers. We start the night before. Caesar at dinner. He receives a scroll, sealed in wax. He burns it unread. Why? Because Julius Caesar had already done what no dictator before him had. Left behind a map. A will naming Octavius. A fund to win over the plebs. Orders not written in ink, but in perception. He didn't want immortality. He wanted irreversibility. Multiple sources confirm Caesar had informed intelligence of the conspiracy. He joked about dying at the Senate. Why didn't he act? Because he believed killing him would prove his necessity. The Republic was a ghost. Caesar didn't kill it. He just made it haunt Rome forever. Forget the paintings. This wasn't a clean assassination. The first blade missed. Caesar turned, grabbed a toga, fought, screamed. It wasn't political, it was frenzy. One of the stab wounds entered through Caesar's genitals, a fact Roman historians avoided mentioning. It wasn't just murder. It was humiliation. And still, he didn't call for guards. He pulled his toga over his face, not to hide, to control how he'd be remembered. That wasn't surrender. It was design. Brutus walks out believing he saved Rome. But here's what viewers don't know. Brutus had no succession plan. No public speech ready. No alliance secured. That same evening, a mob set fire to the Senate steps. Not in celebration, but in confusion. They killed Caesar. But they left his momentum alive. In days, Rome would worship his memory. Burn wax figures of his corpse in effigy. Swear oaths to his name. And Brutus? He fled into the hills. He didn't save the Republic. He gave the empire its first martyr. Octavius, just 18, studying in Apollonia. The news reaches him and he doesn't cry. He sends for Caesar's will, then vanishes for 3 weeks. No one knows what he was doing. But when he returned, he came as Gaius Julius Caesar, adopted son, bearer of the people's grief. He was no soldier. But he carried a weapon more lethal than any sword. Expectation. Octavius personally forged dozens of letters claiming veteran legions had pledged loyalty to him. It wasn't true, yet. But within months it was. Cleopatra arrives weeks after Caesar's death, with her son, Caesarion. She brings ledgers, maps, supply chains. She wants protection. Antony offers it. Cleopatra sent encrypted letters to key Roman senators. Not love notes, but intel. She knew who profited from Caesar's assassination. She made that clear. Rome feared her beauty, but they should have feared her memory. When Brutus and Cassius marched east, Cleopatra leaked their supply movements to Octavian. Why? Because she wanted her son on the throne, and she didn't care which Roman handed it to him. By the end of 44 BC, the conspirators are gone. Octavian and Antony divide power. Cleopatra plays both. But the moment that seals it isn't a battle. It's the moment the Senate votes Octavian the title Augustus. Why? Because by then the people believed only one man could restore peace. They didn't vote for Augustus. They voted against remembering the chaos of choice. The title Augustus had no legal meaning. It meant the revered one was invented. And it worked. They thought killing Caesar would resurrect the Republic. But they misunderstood power. True power doesn't die with the man. It hides in his name, and waits for the boy he raised in shadow, to wear it like a crown. Next chapter, Augustus, the man who made monarchy look like a favor. We begin not with a coronation, but with a census, a coin, and a quiet purge no one dared question. They called it a republic. But ask a plebeian, and they'd say it felt more like a cage. We don't start with laws. We start with a father holding a knife. Virginia is dragged into the forum, accused of being a slave. She's not. But Appius Claudius, a patrician judge, wants her, and he controls the court. Her father, a soldier, arrives just in time. He begs the people for justice. They give him silence. So he kills his daughter in public rather than let her be claimed. The law said he committed murder. But Rome said he preserved virtue. This wasn't an isolated incident. The 12 tables gave fathers absolute power, including the right to kill their children. This wasn't order. It was domestic tyranny baked into civic law. The people revolt. But the Senate gives them something better than reform. Time. 450 to 449 BC. The Decemvirs, 10 men with unchecked authority, ruled Rome. They promised clarity. Instead, they created the 12 tables. Legalized debt slavery. Outlawed intermarriage between classes. Empowered execution without trial. The poor asked for laws. What they got was permission to be punished legally. The 12 tables are still quoted by American jurists as the foundation of modern Republican law, even though half of it was designed to silence revolt, not protect rights. He was a hero. Saved the capital from Gallic invaders. Rich, patrician, decorated. But then, he started paying plebeian debts from his own purse. He criticized the Senate. He demanded land redistribution. He didn't betray his class. He remembered his oath. The Senate branded him a would-be king. They executed him by throwing him off the Tarpeian Rock where he once defended Rome. His name was struck from records. His house demolished. A law was passed banning any patrician from living near the Capitoline Hill ever again. What happens when heroism threatens hierarchy? 287 BC. The plebeians had had enough. They seceded again the final time. Not to protest taxes, but to demand legal recognition. The result? The Lex Hortensia, a law saying plebeian decisions were now binding for all. It was hailed as a victory for democracy. But here's what viewers don't know. The Senate immediately found loopholes. They created religious vetoes, stalled elections, and funded client-patron systems to keep the poor distracted. They didn't kill the revolution. They fed it bread and sold it to itself. The average plebeian still had no land, no access to elite courts, and no path to consulship. The Republic gave them paper rights. But real power remained locked in ancestral names. The Roman Republic didn't suppress rebellion. It outlasted it. It wrote rights on stone and erased them in practice. Every law passed was a gamble. Will this keep the poor quiet for one more year? And every year they rolled the dice again. Next chapter, Tiberius Gracchus, the one man who dared to ask for land. What happens when someone actually tries to use the Republic's laws? The answer wasn't reform. It was a political assassination, with a chair leg. They called it a victory for the people. But by the time the plebeians were allowed to pass laws for all of Rome, the Republic had already stopped listening. Laws passed by the plebeian assembly, plebiscita, now binding for all citizens, including patricians. But here's what they don't tell you. The tribunes who pushed it through? Already compromised. They were rich, educated. Many from plebeian families that had climbed just high enough to forget what grain prices felt like. The very year Lex Hortensia passed, Rome was engulfed in wars of expansion that would drown the legislative process in military urgency for decades. The Senate let go of domestic control because empire required distraction. Plebeians could argue about farming rights in the Forum while consuls carved up Etruria and Hispania. It wasn't equality. It was permission to speak, while the Senate ruled overseas. By the time the poor got the vote, the Republic had already outgrown democracy. Post-287 BC, the tribunate, the great institution of the plebs, slowly becomes a tool of the elite. Tribune Gaius Scribonius Curio, a former people's man, later becomes an ally of Julius Caesar, using vetoes not for protection but for partisan warfare. Many late Republic tribunes never lived in plebeian districts, and some didn't speak with a plebeian accent. The rich didn't kill the tribunate. They put it in a toga, paid it well, and taught it to smile. The poor still cheered for tribunes, unaware they were voting for actors in borrowed armor. We're told the 12 tables were the first great legal reform. But centuries later, even Cicero admitted they were outdated and irrelevant. Some tables contained superstition, including laws about burying dead bodies outside city walls to prevent ghosts. Yet schools still made students memorize them, not for utility but obedience. The law wasn't alive. It was memorized like a prayer, never questioned, only recited. The Republic didn't fall because it ignored its people. It fell because it made them believe they'd won. Just long enough to forget what power really was. And by the time they remembered, the armies were marching. Not for the Forum, but for the world. The first man to blind Rome wasn't a barbarian. He was a Roman aristocrat who couldn't see, but taught the Senate how to make the people believe they ruled themselves. The Senate had grown tired. Too many tribunes were using their veto, blocking laws, protecting debtors, appealing to gods. So Appius Claudius, an aging patrician now going blind, engineered something revolutionary. He reformed the tribal voting system to favor rural patricians. He introduced plebeians into the Senate, but only those loyal to him. He built the Via Appia and Aqua Appia, massive public works, to show Rome that patricians could be populous. What no one tells you. He appointed himself censor and then refused to leave office when his term ended. He held power illegally for 5 more years. He called it progress. But it was colonization of the people's hope. And when the next tribune stood to oppose him, the crowd booed the tribune. Lex Hortensia, 287 BC. By now, Rome was an empire in everything but name. The generals held loyalty. The wealth flowed from war, not law. And the tribunate still stood, untouched, sacred, irrelevant. So the Senate gave the plebs a parting gift. Lex Hortensia, your votes now count for everyone. But here's the truth. By 287 BC, the assemblies were filled with landowners, war veterans, and clients loyal to patrician houses. They gave you the wheel. But the road had already been paved to their estates. Fast forward 100 years. The tribune steps onto the rostra. The crowd gathers. He denounces injustice, demands reform. But behind the platform, a senator watches silently. The tribune is his nephew, his client, his puppet. By 130 BC, at least 7 tribunes were elected using money from patrician patrons. The law hadn't changed, but the voters had. The crowd no longer represented farmers. They were urban poor, fed with bread, swayed by shows. The tribunate survived, but the people didn't. They built statues of the tribune. They passed laws in his name. They buried him in marble and memory. But ask yourself, if the people really had power, why did their sons die in wars they never voted for? Why did their debts rise with every consul elected? Why did the republic keep giving, after it had already taken everything? Tiberius Gracchus, the first politician to tell the truth and be killed for it. He tried to resurrect the republic's promise. He wore his father's breastplate. He pointed at the law and was met with fists. But the most chilling part wasn't his death. It was what came after. The tribunate became a curse. A position no one survived twice. They didn't need to invade you. They just offered to build your roads. You're a citizen of Beneventum. You've just received a gift, a road. A Roman magistrate offers protection, trade, Roman citizenship. Your city votes yes. What no one tells you is that a clause in the treaty allows Rome to station legions without warning, veto your elections, control which gods your temples honor. Within 5 years, Beneventum's native alphabet vanishes from inscriptions. The first Latin epitaphs appear. Not a war, not a siege, just a road. Rome didn't conquer you with swords. It replaced your memories with milestones. The Samnites were what Rome feared. Mountain warriors, fiercely tribal and politically equal. Women owned land. Councils elected war chiefs. They had their own roads, but they led away from Rome. The Samnites taught Rome how to fight in hills, how to ambush, how to bleed slowly. Rome adopted their tactics, then turned them into law. You don't hate what you fear. You hate what you can't control. After the Caudine Forks, the Romans submitted to the Samnites, temporarily. Then they came back again and again with better weapons and worse intentions. By 290 BC, the Samnite name is outlawed from public orations in Rome. Not just defeated, deleted. The Greek cities of southern Italy thought they were superior, culturally, militarily. Tarentum laughed at Roman emissaries. What isn't often told, Tarentum's last naval commander was drunk when he ordered the attack on Roman envoys. That single mistake triggered Pyrrhus' campaign, and the doom of Hellenic Italy. But Pyrrhus didn't lose because he was weaker. He lost because Rome absorbed every tactic he used. Rome studied you like a surgeon studies a corpse, then carved out what it needed. Appius Claudius Caecus didn't just build roads. He understood what roads do to memory. Every step a citizen took on the Via Appia reminded them, who protected them in war, who controlled trade, who delivered judgment. The stone wasn't just infrastructure. It was ideology. Religious processions were rerouted onto Roman roads to sanctify them. Pagan rituals gave way to Roman state festivals. By the end of the 3rd century BC, dozens of local gods ceased to be worshipped, not by violence but by redirection. They called it the Latin Rite, a gift, but it was a disguise for disarmament. One road, one alliance, one word of Latin replacing 10 in Oscan, Etruscan, Greek. By the time the Punic Wars began, the map still showed many cities. But Rome had already won. Not with armies, with erasure. Carthage, the empire Rome built just to break. They were older. They were richer. They had the sea. But Rome had something darker. A fear that its reflection, Carthage, might live longer. So it swore to destroy the mirror. The first time Rome lost a major battle, it didn't retreat. It took notes. Pyrrhus of Epirus, cousin to Alexander the Great, surveys a blood-soaked field near Heraclea. He's just shattered the Roman legions. His elephants have trampled their formations. His phalanx holds. His prestige surges. But then, he sees something strange. A Roman prisoner asks, "Who replaces the consul you killed?" Pyrrhus replies, "The people will choose another." The prisoner smiles. "Then you haven't won." The Romans lose again at Asculum. Pyrrhus wins. Barely. What textbooks skip is what Rome does next. It forgives rebellious allies who aided Pyrrhus, and offers them Latin rights. It doubles its recruitment quotas from southern Italy, using cities Pyrrhus thought were neutral. It sends spies to Pyrrhus's court, disguised as philosophers, to study how elephants are trained. Rome's first attempt to build a war elephant corps fails miserably. The elephants panic and trample their own legions in a training camp outside Capua. The commander covers it up, and is promoted. Why? Because in Rome, failure that teaches is more valuable than victory that flatters. While Pyrrhus marches, Rome quietly expands its legal empire. It doesn't demand loyalty. It offers privilege, to elites only. The right to marry into Roman families. The right to trade without Roman taxes. The right to migrate to Rome and become full citizens. But there's a cost. Cities must send troops but get no vote. Local assemblies lose autonomy. Their own laws must now mirror Roman ones. By 270 BC, over half of Italy's local judges were trained in Roman legal doctrine, not because of conquest, but because Rome offered scholarships to elite sons. Rome didn't just conquer with steel. It conquered with education as indoctrination. After years of war, Pyrrhus withdraws, not because he is defeated but because no one joins him anymore. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia have been legally Romanized. The Samnites, once proud enemies, are too weak, too fractured. The Roman Senate offers Pyrrhus an alliance as he departs. He refuses. But the real reason he retreats? He sees what Rome has built. Not an empire of borders, but an empire of belief. Rome had no elephants, no navy, no empire. But it had something more dangerous than all three. A system that turned every defeat into doctrine. The next enemy wouldn't come from the hills. It would rise from the sea. And for the first time in its history, Rome would build a fleet to destroy a rival that mirrored everything it feared about itself. The woman's body was buried without a name. Her death was written off as disease. But the priests knew better. A king had flushed his crime into the Cloaca Maxima. And for once, the sewers told the truth. Tarquinius Superbus wasn't feared for cruelty. He was feared because no one knew where his enemies disappeared to. Archaeological note. In the 19th century excavation under the Forum, a skeleton of an adolescent female was found embedded near the Cloaca Maxima's outlet. No tomb, no votive items, no records. She was likely of noble status. No one has accounted for her in any surviving Roman genealogy. The message wasn't her murder. The message was her disposal. Into the sewer Rome's beating vein. Control waste. Control disease. Control silence. The calendar? Not divine. The earliest Roman calendar stone, pre-Julian, is misaligned with lunar cycles by nearly 7 days every third year. Scholars now believe this was an error. It was design. What? Because the Pontifex Maximus could delay elections and court rulings by postponing market days, legally. The priesthood, appointed by Numa, created Rome's first legal delay weapon, not for worship but for power preservation. When farmers noticed the crops didn't match the dates, a quiet riot began. Numa disappeared shortly after. His tomb was never found. Romulus didn't unite the Sabines. The so-called rape of the Sabine women wasn't about founding a family, it was a hostage program. Each Sabine woman was tied by rope to a Roman soldier's hand, even at night. They weren't wives, they were living treaties. Records show that 7 of the Sabine women gave birth within 3 months, not 9. Meaning the abduction was paired with instant rape, not gradual marriage. Rome tells this as myth. But forensic evidence from mass female remains in early Latium settlements shows childbirth injuries at statistically impossible rates, clustering around the same decade. The 100 fathers? Not chosen. They were survivors of a single purge. Romulus' first war for spoils against a fellow Latin town ended with mass prisoner execution. But he spared 100 men with weapons experience. Those became the Senate. They weren't wise men. They were the ones who agreed never to question the king. Roman bronze military tokens used for food rations were found near the early Curia Hostilia, suggesting senators were being fed from the state treasury, not paid but kept loyal by bread. Tarquinius Superbus built Rome's first full stone temple, its drainage, its streets. But in doing so he made the king structurally obsolete. His mistake. He created infrastructure that ran without him. When Lucretia died, it wasn't just a reaction to her assault. It was an excuse. The elites were waiting. They already had networks, food, roads, priests, laws, all without the throne. You don't kill a king. You make the system forget it needed him. They said 7 kings ruled Rome before the Republic. That's not true. Rome wasn't ruled. It was steered by shadows, sewers, silence. And when the crown finally fell, no one mourned, because Rome by then didn't need kings. It had already become a machine. The man who raped Rome didn't die in exile. He survived, in the Senate's rituals, in the laws, in the very republic that claimed to hate him. The republic is barely 4 years old. The kings are gone, right? Except, only patricians can vote. Priests are still appointed by elites. The consuls wear purple-trimmed togas, sit on curule chairs, and are protected by lictors carrying rods and axes. The fasces, the symbol of royal power. Everything Tarquin had, they kept. Only now it was 2 men instead of 1. The consular lictors carried exactly 12 fasces, same number as Tarquin's royal bodyguard. It wasn't reform. It was redistribution. If Tarquin's tyranny was so evil, why did they replicate his every symbol? Fast forward to 496 BC. Rome is dedicating the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. But here's the twist. The foundation stones bear the personal mark of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He commissioned the temple. The workers were loyal to him. The temple is his. A terracotta acroterian roof sculpture, recovered in the 20th century, bears Etruscan glyphs spelling LTRQ. The Senate buried the carving under the new pediment, a symbolic silencing. They didn't destroy his temple. They sanctified it, and lied about who owned it. They banished the man but worshipped at his altar for 400 more years. Lucretia's death is publicized, sculpted, taught in every Roman boy's education. But there were others. A Vestal virgin raped in 516 BC, then buried alive, by order of the Pontifex Maximus. A Sabine girl dismembered by the king's guards for crossing the Pomerium line with a knife. 2 merchant wives from Etruria whose husbands were slain during a false trade treaty, their fates unknown. The records of these events exist, fragmented across tomb inscriptions and priestly tablets found near the Via Sacra. But only Lucretia is immortalized, because her death could be used. The others had no political value. What if Lucretia's purity was preserved only so her corpse could bless a revolution? Brutus makes the Roman elite swear to never suffer a king again. Here's the twist: that oath was illegal. The lex curiata, law allowing magistrates to rule, was still active. The Senate never repealed it. Which means, early consuls operated under royal authority. There was no legal republic until decades later. The republic's founding document was a fraud. Rome wasn't born free. It was born in bureaucratic limbo. A falsified inscription from the Capitoline dating to 495 BC refers to Rex Interrex, meaning Rome still had temporary kings for rituals. Kingship never fully died. They told you the kings were gone. They told you a woman's blood bought your freedom. They lied. The last king never died. He lives in every coin Rome minted, every road Rome paved, every law it wrote in Latin, was first whispered in Etruscan. Rome was not the first fire. It rose from the ashes of another. And that makes everything different. We begin not in Italy but with the ruins of Troy. The man carrying his father through the smoke, Aeneas, was not just a survivor. He was a symbol. In Virgil's Aeneid, Aeneas flees west, guided by the gods to found a new Troy. But in reality, Aeneas never reached Rome. The city we know would not exist for centuries after his supposed death. Early Latin towns used Aeneas as a political bridge between cultures. He was a mythic passport linking Greek prestige to Roman ambition. Rome needed a past as grand as its future would be, so it borrowed one. If Aeneas is a founding father, but never set foot in Rome, who really built it? Twin infants, Romulus and Remus, float downstream in a basket. They're saved, not by humans, but by a she-wolf who suckles them. That's the legend. But archaeologists uncovered something eerie. At least 6 infant skeletons buried near the Lupercal cave where the she-wolf supposedly lived, alongside animal remains and ritual items. The story of the she-wolf may encode a dark reality, that ritual infanticide and animal sacrifice were part of Rome's earliest religious practices. The wolf was sacred and feared. Rome did not crawl from the cradle. It clawed its way from the cave. And when the twins grew up, only one would survive. Romulus draws a sacred furrow with a plow, marking Rome's first walls. Remus mocks them and leaps over them. Romulus kills him instantly. Rome begins not with defense, but with execution. The original Roman festival of Perilia, honoring the founding of Rome, involved jumping over fire and blood sacrifice of a lamb. Some ancient sources suggest it was originally meant to cleanse the land after a murder. Rome's first boundary wasn't stone, it was blood. Romulus becomes king. But no one sees him die. Late in his reign, Romulus disappears during a storm. Senators claim he ascended to the gods. Others whisper, they killed him. Tacitus and Plutarch both record rumors that the Senate, tired of Romulus's rule, murdered the founder of Rome and tore his body apart. His death was never confirmed. His grave never found. A man becomes a god, when no one is left to prove otherwise. All these stories, Aeneas, the wolf, the brothers, were written hundreds of years after Rome's founding, by men like Livy, Virgil, and Ovid, under the rule of Augustus. Rome's myths were not just inherited, they were engineered to unite the elite under a divine destiny, justify Augustus's absolute power as the new Romulus, bury the chaos of civil war beneath tales of fate and foundation. When an empire rewrites its birth certificate, what truths are they hiding? Rome began in ashes. It rose from fire, wolf's milk, and murder. But most of all, it rose from memory made malleable. Because the greatest empire the world had ever seen didn't just conquer nations. It conquered the past itself. The Tiber didn't cradle Rome, it tried to kill it. The soil wasn't a gift, it was unstable. The hills weren't bastions, they were barricades. So why here? Why this cursed basin? The Tiber was flood-prone in the worst way, unpredictable and sudden. Ancient Rome had no dams, no levees. In 241 BC, a Tiber flood destroyed granaries, triggering riots and a temporary suspension of public games. Archaeologists discovered a layer of sediment in the Forum, evidence of repeated flash floods that filled civic buildings with silt and corpses. The Senate had to raise the ground level of the Forum multiple times. Rome's center had to be physically lifted to survive its own river. What kind of civilization doubles down on a floodplain? While textbooks celebrate the 7 hills, most forget they weren't politically united for centuries. Each hill was once a separate tribal seat. Sabines on the Quirinal, Latins on the Palatine, Etruscan settlers on the Celian. The original Roman calendar had 10 months. The other 2 months, January and February, were added later, possibly to bridge the ritual cycle of 2 different hilltop cultures. Even Rome's calendar reflects its tribal patchwork. Rome's unity wasn't natural, it was violently forced into being. Yes, volcanic soil feeds crops. But it also made the walls brittle. Tough as soft. Conquerors like the Gauls in 390 BC used this to dig through Rome's fortifications. They didn't scale the city. They carved into it. Rome's first permanent military fortifications were not on the Palatine or Capitoline, but on the Aventine where poor plebeians lived. The elite were late to reinforce their turf. Power built Rome's myths, but fear built its stones. What if the Rome we admire was first shaped by the class it feared most? Romulus killing Remus wasn't moral tragedy, it was legal precedent. Those who violate sacred boundary lines may be struck down, even kin. Some scholars argue the Romulus-Remus story evolved to legitimize this archaic law. Rome didn't just inherit violence, it codified it. When murder is sacred, what counts as justice? Rome was already nostalgic before it ruled anything. The moment it became a republic, it commissioned retellings of its own past. Livy, Fabius Pictor, Cato the Elder. Their purpose? to make the present feel ancient even when it was new. Early Roman statues were deliberately made to look older than Greek ones, rougher beards, stoic wrinkles, to appear timeless even in youth. Rome's most successful export wasn't conquest, it was the illusion of permanence. Rome's geography wasn't a cradle, it was a coffin cracked open. Its river tried to erase it. Its hills kept it divided. Its soil betrayed it in war. And still, it rose, not because it was chosen, but because it chose itself. You can't bury Rome. It's already under your feet. Somewhere, just beneath a French vineyard or a Turkish sidewalk, lies a Roman road. Over 250,000 miles of Roman roads once crisscrossed the empire, straight, defiant lines stamped with milestones and legal jurisdictions. Modern engineers in Spain, Britain, and Tunisia still discover that their highways follow ancient Roman paths, paved not with marble, but with intention. Rome didn't conquer geography, it reprogrammed it. When Justinian ordered the compilation of centuries of Roman law, he didn't know he was creating the DNA of Europe's legal systems. The Corpus Juris Civilis became the ancestor of the Napoleonic Code, German civil law, and Brazilian and Japanese legal codes. Even the term civilization carries Roman fingerprints. From Civitas, the Roman concept of collective legal identity. In some German courtrooms, Justinian's Digest is still cited, 1,500 years after it was written. Latin is not dead. It fractured into children. Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese, all descendants, all haunted by the syntax of senators and Caesars. But even in English it hides. Agenda versus exit, auditorium, empire. Every courtroom oath, every political speech, every church hymn, speaks in Rome's accent. When America was born, its architects looked not to Britain, but to Rome. The U.S. Senate, the Capitol, the eagle, the concept of a republic without a king. Founders like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson devoured Livy and Cicero. Later, revolutionaries in France cried liberty with a Roman dagger in hand, and built their civil code atop Roman precedents. Rome became the ghost advisor of every nation that wanted to break kings, but not laws. For 76 AD didn't end Rome. It ended one Rome. The East lived on in Constantinople for another millennium. The Church adopted Roman rituals, hierarchies, and architecture, then rebuilt the Vatican atop Rome's bones. Renaissance thinkers reanimated Latin manuscripts. Enlightenment philosophers dusted off Republican ideals. Fascists and republics alike invoked the Roman eagle. Rome didn't collapse. It migrated into our books, our buildings, our blood. Rome knew something dangerous. Stories outlive armies. Laws outlast swords. And memory, when shaped carefully, can outgovern any ruler. From its first ritual murder to its last imperial prayer, Rome's genius wasn't marble or military. It was this. It made the world believe it had never truly ended. Some ruins fade. Rome echoed. In our languages, in our laws, in the way we govern, the way we build, the way we dream of order carved from chaos. Rome is not the past. It is the hidden structure beneath the present. And if you listen closely, it's still speaking. If this journey shifted how you see the world, if Rome now lives in the corners of your daily life, then don't let this be the end. Like this video so it echoes further. Comment your questions, your doubts, your theories, your truths. Subscribe to be here when the next empire rises or falls. And hit the notification bell, because the next chapter of history might already be unfolding. right now.